We have to keep in mind that what's happening is very, very straightforward. It's not readily apparent to everybody in the United States, or for that matter, I imagine, in Western Europe. But the truth is that Ukraine, its army, its state are disintegrating. That's not a secret, as you've pointed out. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of people here who don't get it. And that's in part because you have numerous retired 3-4-star generals showing up on television to tell everybody that things are just fine and with a little more money, Ukraine can win. Pretty soon it'll be impossible to conceal the disaster. But the failure of Ukraine and the Ukraine project, the proxy war against Russia, is also leading to something else that you talked about, and that's the disintegration of NATO. And with NATO, the European Union. And your point about the absence of any focus on either the EU or NATO at this point, any serious focus, reflects the reality. The President of the United States has no intention of attending the NATO summit meeting next week. I think it's next week, because he doesn't need to. There's nothing to talk about. And the people in NATO have actually marginalized themselves to the point where, frankly, whatever they think or whatever they try to do doesn't matter. NATO is a bluff. It's an empty bluff. And no one in their right mind, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, in Great Britain or France or Germany or anywhere else that I can think of, wants to suddenly join the sinking ship of Ukraine and march east to stop the Russians from advancing. There's no interest in that whatsoever. And Putin has turned out to have exercised patience and been very smart and restrained the use of force only to the point where he needs to employ it. And this is now becoming very, very clear. I think, finally, the Kushner-Witkoff visit was a reflection of the people that ultimately control and dominate Donald Trump. But they were trying to rescue something from the wreckage of Ukraine. They were trying to give President Trump an excuse to show up with President Putin and sign some document that would then confer some degree of gratitude and legitimacy on President Trump for having brought the war in Ukraine to an end. I guess this would have been his 19th war or 20th war, whatever he says. That's not going to happen. And that's not because Mr. Putin wasn't willing to cooperate. He'd be happy to throw a bone to Donald Trump and say, here you go, President Trump. But he can't do it because there's nothing left to throw. So the game is up. It's over. And everything that you described, the picture you painted, could not be more accurate. We're all going to stand around and sort of watch a lot of people go down the drain. And frankly, we really ought to celebrate, because the people you're talking about deserve to go down the drain quickly.
It has been a catastrophic misjudgment, and I'm not an educated man like you. I left school at 16. If I could see on day one how this was going to end, it is astounding to me that all these exceedingly clever, or at least exceedingly well-educated fools in the governments of Western countries were simply unable to see it. You and I have been talking since the beginning of the war, and whilst the words change, the underlying meaning has never changed. That Russia, existentially threatened by this, could not lose. I mean, literally could not lose, because if they lost, they were over, and therefore would use any and everything that they had to avoid losing, just as the US would if faced with a conventional military threat from Mexico or from Canada. Why do you think the misjudgment has been so great, Colonel?
Well, the first answer is money. Money is responsible for a great deal. Do you think all of these retired generals and politicians that are piling on to talk about support for Ukraine, and Ukraine within a few more inches of victory if they only get a little bit more money, is not a function of money? Of course it is. These people are on the payroll. They've all been rewarded handsomely for years by the various banking interests in the city of London, New York City, everybody in Washington in one form or another. I suppose this is probably true in your country as well, but it's certainly the case in Washington. Almost everybody's on the payroll for someone. Some lobbyist somewhere is funneling money to people, and they respond to the gift, the financial gratuities. It's depressing. But there's another reason, and that is there's a false sense of absolute superiority in the United States. People are absolutely convinced that they cannot be challenged, that we are invulnerable, invincible. And the fragile economy, which is nothing more than another shell game financially, that's all going to collapse pretty soon as well, has been concealed from the American public. In a lot of ways, the arrogance in Washington is comparable to the arrogance in London in 1914, when large numbers of otherwise educated people were very stupid and entered that war when they never needed to get into it. And the British Empire, in my judgment, really began dying in great numbers on the battlefields of the First World War. It never really recovered. The Second World War simply finished it off. Nobody was thinking about the number one interest that should guide everyone's behavior. That is the survival of the state and the people that live in it. That's your number one concern. And anybody with that concern would not have behaved as these people in NATO have. They have demonstrated no interest in the survival of their own peoples, their own culture, their own identity. Nothing. They are all part of the globalist scam designed to extract as much money as possible and put it in their pockets and enrich them while their own populations and their own countries go to hell.
Indeed, and not even paved with good intentions. It's been a road ill-intentioned and corrupted, as you say, right from the beginning. So what now, Colonel? I mean, it seems to me that Trump is just allowing this war to continue, knowing that the direction is only one way. He dodged, or Kushner dodged, Witkoff dodged a meeting with Zelensky today. They are not interested in further talks about Ukraine. They're more into now post-war relations between the US and Russia. I won't embarrass them by giving their names, but the last time I was in Moscow, it was filled with Donald Trump type Americans. They're all there trying to get to the front of the queue for the new post-world order. Some household names are now actually living and working in Moscow, mostly below the radar, but not entirely. It seems to me that Trump, true to type, is he's probably negotiating a Trump Tower in Moscow right now.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. Greed triumphs over reason at every turn. I'm sure he's not doing it, but it could be one of his sons. Let's be frank, that's been an ongoing problem. Witkoff's son, everybody's family is involved, once again, in enriching themselves. It's just shameless corruption. But there's something else happening, and that is there's an awareness that this thing called NATO and the EU are effectively irrelevant now. Now, that's a fault in large measure of Donald Trump. Donald Trump always had the power, as soon as he was elected, as the leader of NATO, to step in and sit down with the Europeans and say, look here, this can't go any further. This must end. None of us have an interest in going to war with Russia. We need to normalize relations with Russia. This man, Zelensky, needs to go. We need to put a new government in there. We need to end this war as soon as possible because, frankly, it's dangerous to us. He never did that. In fact, he's ultimately done the opposite. He said, I'm abdicating my responsibility for leadership of NATO. If you Europeans want to carry on the war, well, I'll sell you whatever you'd like to have. You may not see it for 2, 3, or 4 years, but I'll be happy to take your money. What a terrible thing to say. What a catastrophe for the American people in Europe. There was no sense of obligation to humanity, just as we've seen no sensitivity whatsoever to the mass murder and expulsion of human beings from the West Bank and Gaza. We've seen the same thing towards Ukraine. What difference does it make how many Ukrainians die? And oh, by the way, we can always lie and say the number's half of what's reported. All of that's beginning to go away. And in the meantime, Donald Trump thinks he can rescue the petrodollar by gaining control of Venezuela's oil resources, because it certainly doesn't have anything to do with drugs. There aren't enough drugs to keep London high for a week coming out of that place. So I think Donald Trump has made serious mistakes. He's been revealed for what he is. It's tragic because a lot of us supported the man because he said the right things, but he hasn't done the right things.
Well, when all is said and done, there's a lot more said than done.